I went to undergrad at Stanford University, where I ran track. I played a lot of sports throughout my life. I played basketball, soccer, lacrosse, tennis. When I was younger, I always wanted to be a physician. In medicine, you have a unique ability to use your hands or your mind and affect change in someone else's life. I was in my third year of orthopedic surgery residency at Yale, and that's when the accident happened. I jumped into the pool and ended up breaking my neck. I was paralyzed from the chest down immediately. During my rehab process, I wasn't able to use my arms. There were things that we take for granted. It took me an entire 1-hour occupational therapy session to put on my pants. After my accident, I didn't know exactly what I was going to do. I wasn't able to practice medicine. That's when I was happy to learn that I also had long-term vocational rehab. They are trying to give you new opportunities for skills or training that may allow you to enter the workforce in a place that you previously were unable to based on your injury, and then helping me to see that I could get back to my old profession as well. September 8th, 2013, when I moved my leg for the first time, was one of the most amazing days of my life. It wasn't some small flicker of a little muscle. I extended my leg at the knee, and that's what happened for the first time. So it was pretty sweet. I didn't want my disability to define what I could and couldn't do. Not only did I get back to the old work I did before, but I was also able to get a master's degree, which then opened up new opportunities as well. I have a catchphrase called disabusing disability, hoping to demonstrate that being disabled does not mean that one is unable.
Hi, Dad.
Hey, Al. How are you? Alexander, my son, is amazing. The beautiful thing about children is that they know no limitations themselves. And so to Alex, I'm the coolest dad in the world. Every action, every decision, every instance in someone's life sets off a ripple effect in ways that you can't really tell the downstream consequences of one specific event. When asked at times if there's anything I would change, I can't say that I would.
Well, we apologize for the technical difficulties, and we'll have an opportunity to engage the audience so that you have a chance to sort of hear the story that the video would have told in just a moment. But welcome to another episode of The Flavor in the Barbershop. I am your host, Lloyd Hilton, Director of Strategy and Performance for GCO Learning and Performance. And I'm joined by Jeff Newbill, Field Training Manager, Inflammation Business Unit, and host of The Flavor. Hey, Jeff.
What's up, Lloyd? How you doing?
I'm good. Why don't you tell everybody a little bit about, what is The Flavor?
Yeah, for those of you who have not had a chance to join us on The Flavor or The Barbershop before, we'll start with The Flavor. Essentially, it's a podcast series that's aimed at shining light on the people, the important topics, and the work that's being done in the realm of diversity, inclusion, and belonging, both inside and outside of Amgen. So what we aim to do here is to educate, elevate, and inspire our colleagues to come along with us on this diversity journey. And today that takes us to the shop, which normally the purveyor of is our good friend Drew Bay, who's not here with us today. But we do have yet another special guest, as you saw by the video. So really excited to be here today, and welcome everybody.
Appreciate that, Jeff. So just so our audience knows, today's episode is being recorded. And as we move throughout today's discussion, if you have a specific question for today's guest, please, we're going to ask you to simply type it into the chat feature, which we will be monitoring. We may not have time to get to all the questions, but we'll do our best. We'd also like to take a moment and thank our sponsor today, Global Learning and Performance, who has graciously allowed us to make today's episode part of the Staff Development Series learning track that is dedicated to all things diversity and inclusion and belonging. So Jeff and I are beyond ecstatic today to introduce you to today's guest, Dr. Oluwaferanmi Okanlami. Let me just read a little bit about Dr. O's background. Dr. O was born in Nigeria before immigrating to the US at a very young age. He is a graduate of Stanford University, where he also ran track and field and served as the captain of the team for his last 2 seasons as he achieved academic All-American recognition. He then earned his MD from the University of Michigan before matching into orthopedic surgery at Yale. He has a master's in engineering, science, and technology entrepreneurship from the University of Notre Dame, and he completed his family medicine residency at Memorial Hospital in South Bend, Indiana. He's currently an assistant professor of family medicine, physical medicine, rehab, and urology at Michigan Medicine, and the interim director of services for students with disabilities, or SSD. He also holds several additional director positions. He has spoken around the country on topics related to diversity, inclusion, belonging, and equity, including but not limited to the lack of Black male physicians and creating a health system that is accessible and inclusive to both patients and providers with disabilities. He has been featured on CBS News, Fox News, PBS NewsHour, MSNBC's Morning Joe, and Good Morning America with Robin Roberts. If we can please give a warm barbershop welcome to a true trailblazer, Dr. Farami Okanlami.
All right.
Hello, gentlemen. Nice to meet you all. Nice
Hey
to have
there.
me on the Flavor in the Barbershop. I appreciate you.
So typically, my boy Drew, this is his part of our program, right? And Drew talks about the barbershop and what it really means. So again, as we noticed, you looks like you got your fade tightened, and probably you keep Alexander's fade tight also. So in the African American community, we know the barbershop serves, as Drew would say, a plethora of purposes, from fellowship and mentorship, therapy sessions, dialogue on just about anything, comedy, and the occasional merchandise purchase if somebody comes through with something. And last but not least, instilling that confidence and self-esteem through a makeover in the form of a fresh haircut. So those are the words of my good buddy Drew. But what I'll ask you, Dr. O, when you reflect on your barbershop experience as an adolescent or adult, what is the first word or thoughts that come to mind for you?
So, Jeff, first of all, that introduction, that background, that explanation is great because first, I'm flattered that you all think that my fade is tight because I cut my own hair a couple days ago and it wasn't looking all that right. But luckily, it's grown back in a little bit. I had to give myself a little shape up before this because I had a talk earlier today. So I appreciate whatever y'all think looks okay. That's at my own hands. So I appreciate that.
Well, my advice to you, though, is, when you need plumbing, go get a plumber. That's all I'm going to say. I'll leave it at that, right?
And
don't cut yourself with on fade. Don't do it.
And I have enough evidence of why that should be the case. I will say, though, I did try my hand at times in high school and college. I cut other people's hair, though. So it's a little harder on myself. The lineup in the back's not always straight when I do it. But I got the dual mirror situation that I do when I do it myself. But the word that comes to mind, honestly, is community. Community, because no matter what, and the interesting part about this, I told you guys when we were preparing for this that I'm just going to always be real and I make things relevant to what's happening. But I actually have a colleague of mine. This will seem like a digression, but I guarantee it'll be connected. A colleague of mine, is a Caucasian male physician that I trained with in my residency, and he and his wife of similar ethnicity adopted 2 Black boys. And so they lived in a small town in southern Illinois and have now returned to South Bend, Indiana. And because they recognize the importance of that community, they recognize how you talked about sort of that fresh cut, instilling this confidence and being able to then go and have sort of a rejuvenation of your spirit when you're in that barbershop. They called me because they wanted to know what barbershop should we be taking our sons to. And so just a couple of days ago, they actually sent me a picture of their son that's really enjoying the barbershop that he goes to, because it's much more than just getting a haircut. You talked about the occasional merchandise. You talk about the communication, the camaraderie, and that's what it has been. And I think that's why, especially as we will eventually probably get into some COVID conversation today, that's why utilizing the barbershop as sort of a centerpiece of many communities to then disseminate information, that is what it has always been. because
Mhm.
that's where you will have people talking about whatever's happening in the community, whatever matters to the community. And if there's something that the community needs to be aware of, and you come in and you haven't touched base with the barbershop, I think you're missing an opportunity to truly make sure that community knows that you're coming to do something with and for them. And so that's what I always think of when I think of the barbershop, regardless
Mhm.
of where I am. And you can find a barbershop in a community when you don't even live there, right? I went down to
Right.
Mississippi to give a talk, and I went to a barbershop because I needed it, but I also got some information about what was going on in that surrounding community so that when I gave my talk, I had that context as well.
Yeah, yeah, that's very important because we asked the same question to our last guest, Christian Cooper, and he had a very unique kind of perspective on what the barbershop meant for him, coming up in his area where he grew up in Connecticut. And one of the things we always say that connects us is, we're all African American males here that are on the call, but our experiences and background are vastly different. And it's funny you mentioned COVID as well, because I know in several cities they did use the barbershop as a information tool for a lot of people who were skeptical to get the vaccine. So you're right. It's extremely important and powerful tool in the community and beyond. So that's why we use that kind of format here in order to disseminate information to our colleagues here at Amgen, to get us some further education on the different subjects that we bring to light. All right, so now let's take a shift and move a little bit more towards your story. The video, I've watched it several times, and it's moving and inspiring each time I've seen it. But that's really only the beginning of your journey, as Lloyd's introduction alluded to some of the many things you've done. So, but let's help our audience understand, what do you mean by disability doesn't mean inability? Can you just expound upon that a little bit for us here?
Absolutely. And in order to do so, I'll start back a little bit. So you guys
Okay.
gave a nice flattering introduction, talked about how I was a collegiate student athlete and academic All-American, went to medical school, became an orthopedic surgery resident. It was during my orthopedic surgery residency, however, that I experienced a spinal cord injury. I jumped into a pool and I broke my neck. I was paralyzed from my chest down, very minimal use of my upper extremities. And leading up to that point, however, as I said, my academic and athletic accomplishments were what I thought determined my value, right? I thought that the
Mm.
fact that I could jump across the sand, run fast, dunk on people, become a surgeon, operate, that I was killing it, right? And then all of a sudden, all of that seemed to change. And I was laid up in a hospital bed with a collar on, without the ability to feed myself, bathe myself, toilet myself, use the bathroom on my own, over to any of those things. And then I asked, what is my worth then? Right? If I wrapped up all of this worth and my ability to then do physical feats, if I wrapped up all of this and my ability to then have degrees and pedigree, then where do I stand at this point? And it was something it was a jarring event. However, what I realized at that point was that nothing about me changed. I was the same person with the same goals, the same desires, the same interests, yet it was what I had access to around me that changed. It was the inability for the society, for the structure, for the communities to then allow me to then reintegrate because things were not accessible. Now, we talk about accessibility, just physical accessibility in that sense. When people could literally keep me out of places because they didn't have a ramp, I tell people I've been a Black man my entire life. So I've lived what it's like to be a Black man in this country, and not just a Black man in this country, but a Nigerian immigrant Black man with a long real name that's Oluwaferanmi Okanlami. So having a long, funny name like that when you're going through school doesn't always make it the easiest thing for people to want to include you in things when they don't even know how to call your name, right? And so it wasn't until I then entered the world on the other side of the stethoscope, as I call it, that I saw how inaccessible our world was for individuals living with disability. So I then sort of embarked on this mission to then try to change the stigma associated with disability, to let people know that disability doesn't mean that someone is unable to do it, right? We make assumptions about what people can't do based on what we see, but we don't give them enough of an opportunity to demonstrate what it is that they actually can. And so that's what it is, trying to change the stigma of disability. I'm not trying to pretend like, oh, if you're paralyzed from the chest down and you can't walk, I'm saying, oh, no, you can walk. No, you can't walk, but that doesn't mean you are unable to do everything else, that you're unable to then have an impact on this world. And so hopefully it's trying to reshift what people put value in, and that we allow people to, you know, as people said, to judge somebody by the content of their character, right? Instead of the insert other thing here, instead of color of their skin, instead of place that they worship, instead of the person that they love, instead of the whatever, right? And disability absolutely should not limit people from achieving whatever level of success they want. But in order to get that success, they first need access. And people are not given access based on whatever marginalized group they fall in. And disability is one of those groups that people keep out.
Wow. Yeah, that's amazing, because, you know, I heard you a conference recently that talked about turning that awareness into action. And one of the concepts that was introduced there was really talking about when we talk about inclusion, diversity, inclusion, and belonging, which this fits right under that umbrella, correct? You know, we talk about the diversity piece from a race or gender standpoint, but it's that inclusion and belonging that's really important in what you're talking about. If I walk up to a building and somehow I can't get in, you know, that's a huge factor. And they said one of the biggest challenges that it's not necessarily, it's a systems issue and not an individual issue for that person that's in whatever marginalized group that is. And that the problem becomes when when the majority will look at things from that perspective of, you know, this is my house, and okay, how am I going to share my house with you, versus this is our house, and how can we make our house? Because if it were a spouse or a child or an elder that was experiencing what, you know, is being experienced, no matter what the disability or whatever it is, it might be handled a lot different. So, you know, what's been the challenges there in the awareness, and especially in the things that you're doing now, in getting that heard?
So, you know, it's interesting you talk about the my house, our house sort of way to frame this. And in the middle of the pandemic, I actually had an opportunity to give a TED Talk. The TED Talk was supposed to be filmed at Wrigley, you know, in Chicago, the baseball field. But because of the social unrest that was happening at that time, it actually ended up not being safe to film the day that I was supposed to be filming. And so other people were able to film their TED Talk there. But I actually filmed mine in historic Bronzeville neighborhood, actually with one of the state reps, Cam Buckner. So we both filmed ours at Bronzeville, actually at the site of a former store that had burned down. But reason I bring this up is because, you know, the context here is one that I've never really publicly discussed with people, but you have to picture this now. So I drive a big black with fully tinted GMC Yukon Denali XL. So it looks like a government vehicle of some sort, right? I have a physical disability such that I can't just hop out of my car quickly and do anything. And what was happening at that time is that people were not always safe in the streets, given some of the things that were happening, right? So I'm not trying to then align with one or the other side in this conversation. I'm just painting the real picture of what was going down there, right? So if I'm inside my car, nobody knows who is inside that car. And so certain things could have happened to my car driving through that area because of what they thought the car might have been. But then if I got pulled over and somebody wanted me to get out of the car, I, because of my disability, wouldn't be able to get out of the car and comply with their instructions as quickly as they may have wanted me to. And they may have misinterpreted my disability as an inability to then comply with their wishes. And who knows what would have happened. So because of all that, we ended up moving my event to somewhere else. But I use this as an example because that talk was about, I use Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. For anybody that's around my age or older, people should remember Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. And he started by saying, it's a beautiful day in the neighborhood, right? But what I was talking about was the fact that in many neighborhoods right then, it was not a beautiful day, right? And I take it back to Jim Crow era rules too, where it was not a beautiful day in a certain neighborhood, depending on the color of your skin. And therefore, what we need to see is that, was that a problem just for those neighborhoods? Or is that a problem for all of us? And if we actually were to love our neighbor as ourselves, if we were to feel as though the house in the neighborhood that's on fire is my neighbor's house, is it something that we care about now because we don't want our house to burn down, right? Are we worried that that fire is going to come to my house? Or is it that we care about the person in the house that's being impacted? So that is when we think about my house versus your house versus our house. When we talk about neighborhoods then, right, we recognize that all of us should be recognizing that we are truly in the same neighborhood. Depends on what you consider that, right? So I ended up talking about intersecting Venn diagrams because we are all Black men on this call, but we acknowledge that we are Black men that have different backgrounds, right? I then have the circle of Black men with you guys. I'll have another intersecting circle though that's African American men with somebody, African Nigerian men with somebody else. I'll have another one that says I'm a Nigerian. I'll have another one that says I'm a physician. I'll have another one that says I'm a Christian, right? I'll have another one that says I'm cisgender. So all of those intersecting diagrams will then make people realize we may have more in common with people than we recognize. But if we don't address that shared identity we have, and we keep on othering people, right? We keep on making it seem like because you are this and I am that, we are in different houses, we are in different neighborhoods. That's what ends up making it such that people don't value and respect each other for the shared sort of beliefs that we should have and the shared need to then make sure that we're putting these fires out no matter whose house it's burning.
Wow. You know, it's funny you say that, and we brought this kind of up in the barbershop when we first did the series, and you know, myself and Wayne and Wayne Moore, shout out to Wayne Moore, the other host of The Flavor, and Drew Bay, who aren't here today, but you know, how while we may have appearances that look similar, our backgrounds and stories can be all vastly different. And then just take it outside of us being Black, like you just mentioned. You know, there's all these other isms that are out there that bring us together. And in many cases, more times than not, we have more in common than we do differences. You know what I mean? It may be from an educational standpoint. It may be from, you know, when we talk about privilege, you know, educational privilege or other kind of privileges that there are out there. And that's what it really stuck out to me, that idea of it being that we need to get to that our house and not let that cultural identity just be based on, you know, appearance or one particular aspect, because people tend to gravitate to things that they're most comfortable with, right? So when they see something they're not comfortable with, it's easy to either just dismiss it or if it doesn't affect you. And the last comment I'll make around that is it's funny you mentioned those neighborhoods because both of my youngest two sons live in that area. One lived right around the corner from Wrigley Field. He went to DePaul. My other son lives further by the Gold Coast. And, you know, I worried for them as the social unrest was going down, just like you said. You know what I mean? Like my son walking down the street could be mistaken for someone that's doing something nefarious and had a really bad outcome. So it was a very challenging time, you know, to see and go through that. And it's interesting that you moved it to Brownsville. I grew up on the South Side, so I know it all too well. But, you know, let's keep that moving. So the other thing I heard you say was in the video was this whole idea of the phrase you coined of disabusing disability. Did I get that right? Maybe you can dig into that a little bit and what you mean by, and I know you defined it in the video, but that really stuck out to me. So maybe comment on that a little bit.
Yeah, so I don't know if we still have the ability to share this slide, but if we can let's pull up slide 5 as I'm giving this talk, please. And I'll start to expand upon that a little bit. So that disabusing disability, the word disabusing is really kind of to rid the notion of, right? Like to change the perception of disability, right? Now, a lot of people have seen a series of slides that people use to talk about equity and inclusion. And the main slide people usually see kind of looks like this one, where you've got people on two sides of an image and they're trying to watch some sort of sporting event on one side of the fence. And on one image, the people don't have the resources that they need to be able to then fully engage in whatever's on the other side, right? Most people, they all get one box, and that's the side that usually says equality, right? Underneath it, it usually says equality, and people say equality is giving everybody the same thing. But in this slide, when you look at it, and I went to this slide first because I usually start with a couple other slides that most people have seen where it's just two halves, boxes, all the same on one side, and then the boxes were changed on the other side. But this one is how I end, because I tell people that no matter how many boxes you would give me as a wheelchair user, I wouldn't be able to then see that game without the appropriate resource for me, right? But that conversation starts from, and I usually say, we need to talk to people on both sides of this fence. As I usually move through this progression, I say that when people were playing these games, right? You think that the fence, when we talk about equity and equality, some people say, I want the slide for justice. The slide for justice says that the fence shouldn't be there in the first place. But I take it one step further and I tell people, if we don't talk to the people inside the fence, we may not realize that The fence wasn't there to keep anybody out. The fence was there to keep things in. So people on the inside of the fence say, we did that so that the ball wouldn't roll across the highway that's right next to us. And so we put the fence up to keep our things in. We wouldn't know what out of bounds was if we didn't have that fence, right? So if we don't engage with people on both sides of the fence, we don't get to then find out what the solution needs to be to provide everybody with access. So how does that relate to disabusing disability? Because people do not inherently think about accessibility when they do things. Now, I talk about ableism, and I frame it in the same way I frame racism. So racism is not always calling this person racist. Racism is a system that, whether we want to acknowledge it or not, that our country has been built upon. Now, people don't want to say, oh, racism doesn't exist today. I will tell you, racism still is alive and well right now. And it is what has allowed a lot of the things that happened, like slavery, that existed in our country, to then be perpetuated in the policies that still exist. So if we don't recognize that there are certain races that then have advantages because of racism, and unless we intentionally dismantle that, it will be perpetuated. That's what we use to then make that analogy to ableism. And it's easier for ableism because I say the fact that there are still so many buildings that don't automatically have ramps to get in, or a curb cut to then get on the sidewalk, or an elevator, or some sort of physical accessibility, despite the fact that it's now going on 31 years after the Americans with Disabilities Act, demonstrates that ableism, or a mindset that the majority of individuals with physical ability are who we built this for, right? That is ableism. And until we intentionally dismantle ableism, we will find ourselves in a system that is not accessible to people with disabilities. Similarly, until we dismantle racism, we will find ourselves in a culture that still makes it such that certain races have disproportionate disadvantages. And so it's because people view disability in a light that means these people are less than, they're less than capable, not able. We're not literally at the table when decisions are being made. They're not listening to and valuing the voices and opinions of people with visible or invisible or non-apparent disabilities. Because while mine is a visible physical disability as a wheelchair user, anxiety, depression, schizophrenia, bipolar, all sort of mental health diagnoses are also disabilities that then have the same sort of stigma associated with them, and sometimes more so, because people think that, oh, well, if you're schizophrenic, you're not going to be able to carry this job, right? If you're bipolar, we shouldn't trust you with XYZ. If you're depressed, why should I put you in charge of this? People then treat that as if not everyone in the entire world falls on some spectrum of ability and disability, and we stigmatize disability alone and then make people feel as though they're less than able, which is why I wanted to then promote that notion that we need to change, we need to flip the script, we need to change the game. Disability needs to mean something different moving forward. It is just, I equate it to my blackness, because in some places people will think my blackness is a problem. And they will then look at me and think, oh, he's not as smart, or he's not as successful, or he is more dangerous, whatever you're going to assign to my blackness, which is false, right? Similarly, when you look at disability, what are you automatically assigning to that person? Because we all do it. There's conscious and unconscious and implicit biases that people have. And until we start to then flip the script and change the narrative and change the game and show people that disability doesn't mean what you may think it means, and we need to provide access, opportunity, awareness for that, then it's not going to change until we do it. And I know you asked me earlier about something. I'm going to pause so that you get a word in, but I could talk all day about some of the things we're working on to try to do that.
I love it, man. That's exactly, what we came here for, is to hear that perspective that you bring to it. And, as we prepared for this, speaking with Lloyd and some of the things you brought up, that word ableism really stuck out, to me, because we talk about all the other isms, racism, sexism, whatever it may be. And, two other words that come to mind for me also are, ignorance and prejudice. Ignorance, people think those are bad words, right? But it all depends on the context of using the word. So ignorance, obviously, from the Latin ignome, meaning to not know. As my grandfather would say, it's okay to be ignorant, but it's not okay to stay ignorant, right? Because we have the opportunity to learn and grow in those situations. And prejudice from the standpoint of, what does that word mean? To prejudge, right? So if we're talking about, citizens and our colleagues with disabilities, it's like to judge what I think they may be capable of based on what I think I see, right? So, you may get around in a wheelchair, but that doesn't mean that you're somehow cognitively impaired or able to do any of these other jobs. And I think that's the key is we can get to this space where, people are seeing things and understanding the value of being able to include people with different perspectives. And you touched on another word that I'll have you expound upon a little bit more, and that's the word of that unconscious bias, right? So we are unconsciously prejudiced, right? We see certain things and we automatically form an opinion about it. And bias is also. So when we look at places like Amgen, maybe hiring, maybe all these different practices that you may see in the medical community as well, how do you think, as it pertains to people with disabilities, that unconscious bias has really held things back beyond just getting in the building? Because once you're in the building, that's one thing, right? Then you've got a whole nother set of circumstances to navigate. So how has that affected you, even, I would say?
Yeah. So, and one thing that I told people, I'm a stay real. So when someone said, all right, I have a physical disability, but I'm not cognitively impaired, right? I take that the next step and I say, but even if I were, right? I think people then think if someone has an intellectual disability, that means that they're not going to be capable of doing X, Y, Z. And that's why I take it to every step to bring up the fact that there are plenty of individuals who have unlocked potential that you will never know until you give them an opportunity to show you that, right? And I called out my boss actually the other day, not trying to be negative, but he used a statement or a line that someone always used with him when I will give you the punchline before I give you the what he said. What they were trying to demonstrate was the fact that when you're in a group of people, right, if you've got a little bit of information, a little bit of knowledge that the group doesn't have, then you can still be a leader in that space, right? Like that was what he was trying to convey. But the phrase that he used, what he said, in the land of the blind, even the one-eyed man can be king, right? So if anyone's ever heard that statement, that in the land of the blind, even the one-eyed man can be king. And I said, you know what? I've heard that statement made before, but I'm going to challenge you and say, that in the land of the blind, even the blind man or woman can still be king or queen. Because if people don't recognize that individuals with disabilities can still be leaders, can still be successful, and while people say, oh, that's just a saying, I say it's a saying and words have meaning. So when we continue to perpetuate ableist statements like in the land of the blind, the one-eyed man can still be king, what that does is that perpetuates the notion that if you can't see, then you can't be. And so if you can see a little bit more than me, then you're going to be the one that's going to be the king or the queen. And so that's what I'm trying to change and what people see and how they think, which is why, you brought it up. As I said, it's not a challenge. It's just I always want to make sure that when things happen real time, I share what I'm thinking about them, but not in a pejorative way, but in a way to say, that's what clicked in my head when you said it. Think about the number of people that might not have the same sort of, audacity as I do. When they live in a world and they hear things like that, what that does is it continues to create this culture and climate around them that makes them feel like they're less than. And they're already like, well, man, I'm never going to be king here, right? Because they just said it. And so that's that, prejudgment, right? That's that prejudgment that you talk about, which is not always intentional. And so that goes to what you're talking about with this unconscious bias, is that I tell people all the time, I did not know anything about the disability community before I then entered it myself. So I don't judge people. I'm not critical of that because I know that I would have been saying the very same things, would have not had any idea how I was perpetuating things. But as you said, it's okay to be ignorant. It's not okay to stay ignorant. The same thing that I say is I say the past may not be your fault, but the future will be, right? Because what happened in the past and that creates the ills that we are still seeing today, you may not have contributed to that. And in most cases, you didn't contribute to that, right? But what you're contributing to is what tomorrow is going to be. And so if you are then exposed and introduced to something that someone has now acknowledged is an ignorance on your part, that you were prejudging people in some way, how do you respond to that? How do you then act upon that? And so I think that too often people feel as though they are not empowered to make change. And so in industry, we're talking about like Amgen and within our spheres of influence in the work that we do, I tell people each one of us has an opportunity to then make it such that something that we didn't know yesterday, we then know better tomorrow, and it impacts someone that does not directly impact me, right? If you think that all you need to do is change what makes you feel more included, right? What makes people like you feel valued, we're going to continue to make these silos. We're not going to then be working together to then have a rising tide raise all ships. But once you then see what you can do to then make someone else have more access, make sure someone else is being heard, I tell people to take a look around the table and look to see which seats are empty or which spaces need to be placed there in the first place. And it's not that you represent that person yourself. You go find that person, you give them an opportunity to seat at that table, and you let them use their voice. So I think in these spaces in our work, too often, we don't even recognize who's not there. And when that person or that group isn't there to speak up, then it never changes. So that's that unconscious implicit portion of it, is that I'm not saying that people are always intentionally discriminating or they're intentionally excluding, but they're also not intentionally including and looking around to see. It's like that slide I showed earlier, right? The whole purpose of that slide was that there were people of different races in there. There are people of different genders in there. There are people with different abilities in there. In the top right image, there was a rainbow, which was trying to attempt to then represent the LGBTQ community as well. So in our work, what we need to do is be intentional about making sure that with this increasingly diverse country in which we live, that there are always going to be voices that aren't being heard. And it's not that it's not that I'm going to tell you that you every single time have to make sure that every single checkbox is filled. No, because that's quotas at that point. That's tokenizing, and that's not actually recognizing that the more diverse voices you have, the better the work you'll do, because you're going to have a better representation of individuals who you hope to serve. Because when you go out in the real world, all of these people exist. And especially if you're in an industry that sells something, I'm straight up with people. If you're in an industry that sells something that has some sort of product, and you haven't been able to get into the barbershops in each of those communities that you're trying to sell something to, you're going to have a much harder time getting buy-in from those communities without being in their figurative barbershop, right? So you need those people coming in.
Yeah, and it's funny, we spend a lot of time, and I applaud Amgen. We've had a concerted diversity, inclusion, and belonging effort, and I think a lot of times the challenge for us is it starts with awareness, and that's what we're talking about today in terms of disabilities and being aware and what that means and how that can reflect on other people. But the key is to turn the curve and take that awareness and turn it into action, something that's actionable, so that we can get to the point where, as you mentioned, we have maybe a workforce or a talent pool, whatever, that reflects the communities we serve to be able to come up with better ideas and decisions. So that's really important. Another thing too that I found interesting was around that majority perspective that you mentioned. And so I wanted to take some time to talk about maybe, what it is that you're working on now, or what projects do you have going? We saw in Lloyd's introduction a lot of the things and credentials and titles that you have, but what is it that you've got really passion around now that you're working towards that's coming up next?
So there's anyone that has spent more than 20 minutes with me will know that I love sports, and
me
know
too.
that. There you go. All my life, I played sports. And as I said, when I ended up having my injury, I recognized the fact that we didn't have sports for me anymore, right? I was then introduced to this thing called adaptive sports, which I never heard of. Nothing that I never talked to my patients about adaptive sports. If we could pull up slide 14, I'll be able to show an example of slide 14. But adaptive sports are sports not for individuals with disabilities alone. I think that is the misconception that people have, and that I am trying to change, and our program trying to change, is that I got back to the University of Michigan. So I was introduced to adaptive sports during my rehabilitation, and I was first introduced to wheelchair basketball, and then there was wheelchair rugby. They took me out hand cycling. I saw wheelchair tennis, and I saw that there were sports that allowed me, even though I still had very, very minimal function, very little upper extremity function, my legs weren't doing anything at all, but I was introduced to sports to still be able to stay physically fit, right? I then went back to Indiana, as I said, got that master's, worked with the adaptive sports programs and community, got back to Michigan, and then recognized that the University of Michigan, a top-notch academic and athletic institution, there was no semblance of adaptive sports. And I saw that Exactly. And you know what? I might actually ask him to back up a little bit. If you go to slide 11, I will show you on slide 11 what was really the impetus for them making me stressed and making me know what we needed to do. Right here, this right here is Alabama. Alabama has arguably the world's nation's best adaptive sports program. That building you see in the very middle is a facility that is exclusively for their adaptive athletes. The top is their basketball court. The right is their locker room. You can see that they got their sport wheelchairs tucked in there, and it's angled intentionally so the chairs don't roll back out. The bottom left is their weight room. You can see a whole bunch of wheelchair user student athletes in there. And then the lobby of the arena is on the next side. Now, people see this and they say, wow, indeed, right? But actually, I want you to then go right from this one to the next slide. Because what we're trying to get people to do is we're actually trying to reconceptualize equitable opportunity. Because what I have at Alabama, what I see there, as much as we are envious of them and they set the stage and the bar for what we need to be able to do, is that's separate but equal. Because they aren't using the facility that the rest of the institution gets to use. They had to build their own facility because they weren't given access. What is that? That's, Black people want to be educated. Well, we can have y'all go to those schools over there, right? You don't go to school with us, right? Like, we can have y'all just have your own thing, and that's fine. And so I'm being very careful because I'm not critical of Alabama, and they are an exemplar that sort of paved the way. But what we want to do is, if you go to the next slide, right, what we want to do is we want to say that at the University of Michigan, we have these facilities for our varsity student athletes. And these are the facilities that we are using. So that top two images right there on the left, that's the varsity tennis facility. And we practice at the indoor and outdoor varsity tennis facility. That top right is one of our intramural sports buildings for student athletes that are not varsity athletes. We have students that get to then use that facility. The bottom images are our performance center where we have strength and conditioning, and then the top-notch track and field that we have. So our goal, if you go to the next slide, our goal is truly inclusion and integrating our students and student athletes into the framework of the institution so it is not a separate but equal. We were blessed to then be able to participate in the wheelchair tennis national championships this past year. Just in April, we went down to Orlando, Florida. And as our first year in competition, we came home with the second place finish. And so that's
so you're not too competitive, Dr. Earl, huh? Little competitiveness still going in there?
I don't know what would make you think that. I mean, there's no competitive bone in my body because all is competitive. So no, it was and that's the thing we need people to know is that sport, you don't change in here or in here, right? Disability is a human condition. So when people look at me, I'll tell you, man, when people look at me and then now they think, oh, here's that guy wheeling down the street. You know, I tell people I'm straight up with some of the things I say, not always PC, but it's what my life has been. I'm a 6'1", 240-pound Black man that oftentimes when I'd be walking down the street before, I'd be the person that people would go to the other side of the street for. Now I'm the nicest man in the world as far as I'm concerned. I would never hurt a fly, right? But I know that people, because of how I looked, felt threatened by my mere presence, right? Now what happens, right? Now I'm the person that people don't go to the other side of the street because they think that I'm about to harm them. People then wait for me to roll by. One time I was in this community and I was rolling down the street and then somebody thought that I was coming up to ask them for money. And they said, "I'm sorry, sir, I don't have any change." And I had to look around for a second thinking, are they talking about me?
Who are you talking about, right?
Exactly. I mean, like, and the things that play in my mind, right? What I want to say is, you have no idea what car I just got out of, what home I'm going to, what job I have. Not that those superficial things should define me, but the fact that merely because I am in a wheelchair, you assume that I am homeless, that I need money from you, right? So that is that stigma that exists that's associated with that stuff. So I'm trying to then make sure that from every level, people don't look at disability in that same way. And so when you think about sports, I want people to know that high-level competitive sport exists in this space. And that's what we're trying to get some people access to. But at the same time, we're also embedding adaptive sports curriculum into the physical education curriculum of the sixth graders in our entire city. So the Ann Arbor Public School System, starting this summer and fall, from a grant that we were just awarded from the Michigan Health Endowment Fund, every sixth grader is going to then learn about adaptive sports and inclusive recreation and be participating and playing in them. Because if we can teach dodgeball and capture the flag and tetherball to gym class students, why can't we teach real sports like wheelchair basketball, wheelchair tennis, seated volleyball, that you don't have to be disabled to play that sport? It is just a sport that allows people with disabilities to participate as well. So I tell people, if you were to play hockey, you put on hockey skates, you learn to skate, you play hockey. You don't walk out on there on that ice in your tennis shoes and say, nah, I don't need skates. For that same reason, you can sit in a sport wheelchair and play a sport that's an adaptive sport that requires a chair, and you have to master the maneuverability of that chair, just like somebody with a disability, and y'all can all play together. So those are some of the things we're trying to do to then change this stigma, to then demonstrate that disability is not inability, by then providing these equitable opportunities, putting people side by side and saying, we're in class with you, we're in the gym with you, we're on the field with you, we're at the job with you. And as you spend more time with people, as you said earlier, people gravitate to what they're familiar with. And as you become more familiar with people that look different than you or seem different than you, you learn that there's probably much more you have in common than you thought that you would have never known had you not become more proximal to them.
Yeah, well, that's amazing. And seeing the work you're doing around adaptive sports is, again, something I'll be honest, was somewhat ignorant to, but again, but the key becomes also, right, once we get that awareness around something, what do we do about it? And how do we energize it, turn that awareness into action? And clearly that's what you're doing there with the work you're doing at the University of Michigan. And what it really makes me reflect on is thinking about all those people who maybe had disabilities who were told a certain narrative of what they can't do, and you're showing what's possible. And that's extremely empowering, I think, to anybody out there that may be looking at this and hearing your story. It reminds me of a quote, and having that energy and tenacity and saying, it's not who's going to let me, but it's who's going to stop me. Because ultimately, if it's a goal I've got and I really want to achieve it, and I don't give up and I keep finding a way. They didn't even have this at Michigan, and you brought it there in clearly a major way. But that got back to that quote. It's not who's going to let me. Well, who's going to stop me? This is what we need to do, and turning that awareness into action. And I think that's a great example of what we need to start doing. More and more in all facets of our society. You touched on a whole lot of things there. You mentioned, Jim Crow and all of those different things that all come up. And, the time is flying by here. So I definitely want to give you an opportunity at the end. I'll check really quick for questions. I do have to say my good friend Lloyd, my co-host, ran into some technical difficulties. In my training world, what we say is it's not, if technology is going to fail, it's when. So that's what happened today. But we just,
we just roll with it. That's what I'm used to rolling with it, right? So literally,
that's exactly what we do.
I see. You see,
you got jokes. Roll with it. Okay. I hear you. Yeah. So, with that said, again, thank you definitely for being here today. I think for everyone who's heard your story, and I've yelled it to everyone in our company, you got to come check this out. You've got to hear this story. And I think, the idea that the disability doesn't mean inability, you really kind of opened my eyes to that too. And it reminds me, I have a brother-in-law that has special needs, and, and he's super competitive, and he participates in the Special Olympics. And the first time I went and witnessed that, much to your sport, the adaptive sports, I was just kind of blown away at the level of competition that goes on there. And in fact, he's an avid pool player, billiards. So don't get it twisted. Ricky will tear you up on that pool table. It's like he may not get around the fastest, but so there's that. But
now so Jeff, I'm gonna jump on that real fast too, just because to take the opportunity to make sure that our listeners don't get it twisted. So Special Olympics and Paralympics are two distinct entities that both exist, right? So the Special Olympics are for individuals primarily with intellectual or cognitive disability, and the Paralympics, while the Paralympics will include some individuals that have some degree of intellectual impairment, it is more directly for physical disability. And so that is something that oftentimes people conflate Special Olympics and Paralympics, and they think that if somebody has a disability, that what they're participating in is the Special Olympics. So that's one thing. The other thing about it is that when people, and this is once again just me, I don't speak for everybody, but I actually don't even like the term special needs, because what I say to people is that the needs of the disability community are no more special than the needs that the rest of us have. It's just that the access to those resources isn't provided, right? So the need for me to be able to then, get around and live independently and go into the store and shop and eat and live and love and work and play, those needs, those aren't special needs. the fact that this society has not provided an avenue for me to then have those needs met is what makes it seem like people have to say that they're special. So, and I've taken criticism
special
on both
consideration
sides.
that needs to happen. It's more different than it is special, right?
I think that the needs are the same. The way that you meet them is different, right? The
way
need
that
for
you
me
meet,
to be able to
right.
get around, you have that same need. If I need to
So
use
the
a
what
wheelchair,
doesn't change. The what doesn't change. The how changes.
boom.
And that's what we have to be able to start to embrace in turning that awareness into action is the how and how we go about these things.
Exactly.
Right.
And then with what you said about, it's not about who's going to let you, it's about
Not
who's
who's
going to
going to let
stop
me.
you.
Who's going to
Who's
stop
going to
me?
stop you, right? So
Right.
I'm going to add to that one because many people talk about how you can't be what you can't see. And we use that when we want to talk about representation and diversity, equity, and inclusion. But what I put that next to, it's not about who's going to let me, it's who's going to stop me. Similarly, just because I haven't seen something that needs to be there doesn't mean that I cannot create that. So I agree with the need for representation and I want representation. So I'm never going to then say we don't need to then have adequate representation. But what I don't want to do is to limit someone's possibilities or potential because they just haven't seen anybody that looks like them doing it, right? So that goes to speak to what you say, that you're not going to let somebody stop you, right? Even if you haven't seen anybody before you do it, nothing would have happened until the first person did it. So somebody's got to be that first person. And then you will be that person that other people can see so that they know what they can be. But everybody's at a different point in their journey. And some of the people that are going to be the wood that needs the match to catch it on fire. But some people are just going to be the fire itself that starts things going. And we're all members of the same team, living in the same house, within the same neighborhood. And therefore, it shouldn't matter who's the one that started the fire or who's the one that kept the fire going. If we're all working together to keep this house warm, that's the team right there.
That's it. Goes back to that concept. This is our house, right? And it's how we put it all together. One of my other quotes, anybody that knows me has heard me say, when the why is powerful, the how is easy. So, Jim Rohn said that, and that definitely rings true. One of the things I love about your story and all the things you're sharing here today is you're showing us what's possible. You're showing, that, impossible is just a word, right? It's impossible is not a fact, as Muhammad Ali would say. It's just an opinion. Maybe
or Kevin Garnett.
Right. Going back to us, look at us both in the sports mode too. So funny, you did say we have more in common than we have differences. The one son I referenced earlier, he also ran track and had a college scholarship, and you mentioned going far in the sand, and that was his event, long jump. So kind of funny that you mentioned that too. All right, well, we're coming to the top of the hour here. I want to take this time once again to, first of all, thank the leadership conference that we had this week for allowing us this platform to be able to bring Dr. O on with us. I want to thank my co-host Lloyd, who was only on for a second, but we felt his presence. My co-hosts who weren't able to be here today, Wayne Moore and Drew Bay. And most importantly, we want to thank you, Dr. O, for your perspective, for your honesty, as you said, keeping it real. And hopefully we'll keep an eye on the things that you're doing and maybe bring you back into the barbershop to get caught up on everything else that you're doing.
No, I appreciate you all. And I want to make very clear that we talk about what I'm doing, but it's always been the team, right? I have a wonderful team behind me. I've always had people in my corner supporting. So I'm not the first or the best or the only. I'm not doing this alone. And so just like this was a platform you all provided me to be able to share this conversation. So I thank you for this opportunity. And I want to make very certain to thank all the other individuals that have contributed to this story, because this is not my story alone. It's a story of all my friends, family, coworkers, colleagues, individuals, organizations that have believed in me and provided me with the opportunities to then be able to share this message. So I appreciate y'all.
All right. So as always, it takes a village, right?
Yes, sir.
It takes a village. All right. So with that, I think we're going to wrap it up for today. And also for more information, you can check out our diversity, inclusion, and belonging GCO-LNP pathway in Degreed, where you'll find additional content to educate and elevate around social justice, diversity, inclusion, and belonging, cultural intelligence. You'll see the Flavor podcast is there, as well as the barbershop. And what we'll be seeing coming up in June is our cultural coffee. As we know, June is Pride Month, and we will be focusing on that. So with that said, We're going to sign off on today. Jeff Newbill here, Dr. O, thanks again. And we'll see you guys next time. Take care and be great today.